Imagine a moment so shocking, so devastating. It completely changes the course of a life. What happens when a 17-year-old makes a decision that destroys everything? The story of Jonathan Hoffman and the murder that left a family shattered is one you won't believe until you hear it. Stick around till the end, because the truth will leave you speechless. Jonathan Hoffman had never felt the coldness of the blade before. His fingers trembled, wrapped around it, the metal slick under his grip. The sharp edge gleamed, almost mocking him in the dim light of the kitchen. It was so quiet, too quiet. His breath echoed off the walls, the room feeling like it was closing in around him. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever before. He could hear his own heartbeat, thudding in his chest. There was a strange taste in his mouth, metallic, bitter. He looked toward the phone. The 911 call was still open. His grandma, lying on the floor, barely conscious. He'd done it. He'd stabbed her. But she wasn't dead yet. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The sound made him shiver. He wasn't sure what had come over him. One moment they had been arguing. The next, the knife had been in his hand. He couldn't explain it. The adrenaline rushed through him. It was like watching someone else do it. Her eyes were wide, terrified. She tried to move, but her body wasn't obeying. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She reached toward the phone, her frail hand trembling. The 911 operator's voice crackled through the speaker. She was begging for help. "Stay with me, Grandma. Please, just stay with me," he whispered. But he couldn't stop. The feeling was overpowering. The anger, the confusion, the frustration had built up. It all crashed over him in a flood. The phone call, the sirens in the distance, the sound of her weakening breath. None of it mattered. He only felt the heavy weight of his own actions. Time seemed to stretch out, each second dragging like an eternity. The shadows in the kitchen grew longer. His hands were shaking, covered in something wet. He looked down. It wasn't just his hands. The blood was everywhere. It seeped into the cracks of the floor. It stained the walls, the counter, his clothes. And it was all his doing. His chest tightened as the reality hit him. He didn't know what to do now. Should he run? Should he just wait? His thoughts swirled, but the voice on the phone cut through it all. The operator was still asking questions. "Sir, is the attacker still there?" Yes, yes," he mumbled. "Can you tell me where you are?" His throat tightened. He couldn't speak. He was trapped in his own silence. Everything felt unreal, like a nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was happening. Right now. He glanced toward his grandma. Her eyes were still open, but they were starting to glaze over. The room seemed to pulse with tension. The kitchen felt smaller, the air heavier. Jonathan felt dizzy. Was this how it ended? How could it have gone this far? His hands were still shaking, gripping the phone tighter. He could hear sirens now, louder, closer. But would they make it in time? His mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. He was 17, just a kid. But now he was a murderer. And in that moment, Jonathan realized he could never undo it. Not now. Not ever. The sirens wailed, growing closer with every passing second. Jonathan's heart raced faster, his chest tightening as he gripped the phone harder. His thoughts were a blur, scattered and frantic. He tried to calm himself, but it was impossible. The sound of approaching footsteps outside his door made him freeze. They were here, but the weight of what he had just done pressed down on him like an anchor, dragging him into the depths of guilt. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? The door burst open. 2 officers rushed in, their guns drawn. "Put your hands up," one shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Jonathan froze. His hands, trembling, slowly lifted into the air. He could barely hear the officer's words over the pounding in his ears. His grandma's weak, labored breaths still filled the room. But now it wasn't just her that was suffering. He felt the weight of the officer's stare on him, cold, and accusatory. The room seemed to close in tighter. A flood of emotions overwhelmed him. Fear, confusion, and something darker. Regret. But it was too late for regrets. They moved quickly, one of the officers checking on his grandma. She wasn't moving. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly. Jonathan's stomach twisted in knots. The officer kneeled beside her, checking for a pulse. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Jonathan's shallow breathing. One of the officers turned to him. "Did you do this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more direct. Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He nodded slowly, his face pale. He could hardly believe it himself, but he knew what he had done. The officer motioned for his partner to secure him. "Get him in cuffs," he ordered. Jonathan didn't fight. He couldn't. Everything felt distant, like he was watching himself from afar. The weight of the handcuffs snapping around his wrists felt strangely numb. A sharp pain in his chest reminded him that he was still alive. The officer led him toward the door, his grip firm on Jonathan's arm. Outside, the flashing lights of the patrol cars painted the street in red and blue. Jonathan could see the crowd gathering, whispers in the air. His world was crumbling. The officers loaded him into the back of the squad car. The door slammed shut with a deafening finality. His hands were cold. His mind was still racing, trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't undo what had happened. He couldn't change the fact that he had murdered his grandmother. The weight of it pressed on him harder than the handcuffs. And as the car sped away, Jonathan's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. He saw the flashing lights, the blur of the world around him, and in that moment, he realized there was no escaping what he had done. The squad car rumbled down the street, the lights flashing in a relentless rhythm. Jonathan's hands were still bound, cold against the metal of the seat. His mind replayed the moment again and again, the knife in his hand, his grandma's desperate eyes. He couldn't escape the image of her face, pale and lifeless on the floor. The silence inside the car was suffocating. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and shallow, echoing in his ears. The officer next to him said nothing, but Jonathan could feel the weight of his gaze. The unspoken accusation hung in the air between them, heavy and unforgiving. As they drove further away from the house, Jonathan felt the distance growing between him and his old life. The house, the room, the knife, all felt like another world now. But the reality of what he had done was still here. It was real, and it was crushing him. Every mile that passed felt like a slow, endless crawl towards something inevitable, something that couldn't be outrun. His throat tightened as he tried to push back the tears threatening to spill. He wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. They stuck in his throat like shards of glass. All he could hear was the relentless beating of his heart, thudding against his chest. What had driven him to this point? Why had he let his anger take control? He couldn't find the answers, not now. The city passed by in a blur of lights and shadows. The sirens slowly faded into the distance, but the weight of what he'd done remained. He couldn't stop thinking about his grandma, her frail body, her struggle to stay alive. He had never meant for it to go this far, but there was no going back. No way to undo the irreversible. The car made a sharp turn, jolting Jonathan out of his thoughts. He glanced out the window and saw the looming silhouette of the jail in the distance. It was a place he never thought he'd be. A place he had only seen on TV or heard about in stories. But now it was his reality. And the worst part was, he deserved it. The car slowed, pulling into the parking lot. Jonathan was numb now, his body stiff and unfeeling. As they stopped, the officers got out of the car, and Jonathan was dragged out by his arms. The cold night air hit him like a slap. The lights of the jail flickered above him, and he felt his legs give way beneath him. He was led through the entrance, his footsteps echoing in the hall. Each step felt heavier than the last. A door slammed shut behind him, and Jonathan was left alone in the stark, sterile room. The walls were bare, cold concrete. The air smelled of antiseptic and something deeper, something dark. His hands shook, and his eyes darted around, trying to take it all in. But it was no use. He couldn't escape. This was his life now. The door opened again, and a guard stepped in, his eyes hard and emotionless. "Name?" he asked, his voice monotone. "Jonathan Hoffman," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The guard nodded, then gestured toward the cell door. "Get in," he ordered. Jonathan didn't resist. He walked toward the small, dimly lit cell and stepped inside. The door clanged shut behind him with a finality that sent a chill down his spine. He was alone. But the guilt, no matter how much he tried to push it away, would never leave him. He had killed his grandmother. And now he had to face the consequences. The weight of that truth was unbearable. And in that moment, Jonathan knew that nothing could ever be the same again. The cell was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and never lets go. Jonathan stood there for a moment, staring at the plain, gray walls. His mind raced, but it was like trying to swim through thick, murky water. Each thought tangled with the next, the guilt strangling him with every passing second. He sank down onto the hard cot, his body tense, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and regret. The silence pressed in on him. It was a different kind of silence from before. Before, he had the noise of the house, the ticking clock, the muffled sounds of his grandma's breathing. Now there was nothing. Only the distant clanging of doors, the occasional shout from another cell. And his own thoughts. His own unbearable thoughts. How had it come to this? He could still see her face, the fear, the confusion in her eyes. She had been frail, but there had been a tenderness in her, something fragile that he had broken. The weight of it crushed him. His hands tightened into fists, the anger that led him here bubbling up again. Only this time it felt empty. A hollow rage. There was no one to lash out at now. No one to blame but himself. He wanted to scream, but the sound would just bounce off the walls and fall silent, just like everything else. A guard passed by the small window of his cell. Jonathan stood up, his legs unsteady, and moved closer. He stared out at the hallway beyond, but there was nothing to see. Just shadows flickering under the harsh fluorescent lights. The hum of the lights above him echoed in the emptiness, filling the space where his thoughts swirled. He closed his eyes, trying to block it all out. But the memories wouldn't stop. The sound of the knife cutting through the air, the sharp, sudden pain that followed. The blood. The blood that seemed to get thicker with each passing second. How long had she suffered? How long had she fought for her life, for the chance to breathe just one more time? The question gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into the well of guilt. He clenched his jaw, biting back the sob that threatened to escape. This wasn't the life he had imagined for himself. He had always wanted more, wanted to break free from the cage that had been his childhood. But now, everything was gone, and in its place was this. A cell. A life behind bars. He sank back onto the cot, his eyes staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his own tears, the ones he had yet to shed. He wasn't sure how long he lay there, staring into the darkness, when the voice came. A guard's voice, muffled through the thick walls. "Visitor." Jonathan's stomach twisted, a sharp pang of fear running through him. A visitor? Who would come to see him? His mind immediately jumped to his parents. But what would they say? What could they say? He had killed her. His grandma. The one person who had raised him, loved him, no matter what. He had betrayed that love in the most horrifying way. The door to his cell swung open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was his mother. Her eyes were swollen, red from crying. Her face was pale, drained of all color, and for a moment, Jonathan couldn't recognize her. She stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling. She didn't speak, just stared at him. And Jonathan, he didn't know what to say. Words failed him, caught in his throat. He wanted to tell her how sorry he was. How sorry he had been from the moment he'd seen what he'd done. But all that came out was a choked sob. His mother didn't say anything at first. She just watched him, her eyes filled with something that wasn't anger. It wasn't hate, either. It was pain. The same pain Jonathan felt, but he couldn't bear to look at it. The guilt was too much. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, both of them too broken to cross it. Finally, his mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why, Jonathan?" she asked. Her words were soft, but they cut through him like a knife. The question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Jonathan closed his eyes, unable to answer. He didn't have an answer. Not for her. Not for anyone. Because there was no why. There was only the horror of what he had done. The air in the room felt thicker now, the silence between them suffocating. Jonathan's head dropped, his eyes fixed on the cold, concrete floor beneath him. He couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see the pain in her eyes, the despair he had caused. His mind spun, each thought colliding with the next in a chaotic mess, but all of them led to the same terrible conclusion. He had ruined everything. His mother's voice broke the stillness again. How could you do this?" Her words trembled, like they were breaking her from the inside out. Jonathan swallowed hard, trying to find the words, trying to find something to say. But the words weren't there. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't planned, that it wasn't some cold-blooded decision he had made. But he couldn't. He could feel the weight of what he had done crashing down on him, suffocating him in a way that words couldn't fix. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His mother's gaze never left him, her eyes searching his face, trying to find something. A reason, an excuse, some piece of her son that was still there. But there was nothing left. Jonathan felt empty, like a shell of who he had been. His mother stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out, but stopped just short of touching him. The space between them felt insurmountable, like an ocean of mistakes that couldn't be bridged. Tears welled up in her eyes. "You killed her, Jonathan, your grandmother. The only one who ever really cared for you." Her voice cracked on the last word. Jonathan flinched at the truth in her voice. The words stung, sharper than anything else he had heard since this nightmare began. The thought of his grandma, lying lifeless on the floor, her last moments filled with fear, was a constant ache in his chest. His mind screamed for him to say something, to explain, to take it all back, but he was trapped in a prison of his own making. "I didn't mean to," he choked out, his voice raw. His mother's face twisted in agony. She shook her head, stepping back. "You still did, Jonathan. You still did." The words hit him like a slap, each one echoing in his skull. The door behind his mother opened, and an officer stepped in, his eyes darting between them. It was a silent reminder that Jonathan wasn't free. He wasn't free to explain himself. He wasn't free to fix it. The officer cleared his throat, and his presence seemed to cut through the moment. "We're going to have to take him back now," he said, his tone impassive. His mother didn't look at the officer. She stood there, tears silently falling down her cheeks. Jonathan wanted to reach out to her, to tell her how sorry he was. But he couldn't move. He was paralyzed by his own guilt, the suffocating weight of his actions. The officer gestured for Jonathan to stand. Without a word, he stood, his legs unsteady, as if his body had forgotten how to move. He was taken out of the small room, his eyes still on his mother. Her face was a mask of pain and disbelief, and Jonathan's heart shattered as the door clicked shut behind him. In the hallway, the coldness of the jail seemed to press in even harder. His mind was numb. He was being led down a sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor, each step feeling like it took him farther away from anything real. The sound of the footsteps echoed off the concrete walls. Each step was a reminder of where he was now. He had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. The hall stretched out before him, endless and gray, the walls closing in like a tunnel. Each step felt heavier, like his feet were sinking into the cold, unforgiving concrete beneath him. The guard's footsteps were sharp and authoritative, his presence a constant reminder that Jonathan wasn't free. Not anymore. Jonathan's mind wandered, replaying the horrible, horrifying moment. His grandma's face, her fear, the lifelessness of her body. He could still feel the weight of the knife in his hand, the blood soaking into his skin, staining everything. He tried to block it out, to focus on the present, but it was impossible. They turned a corner, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting strange shadows on the walls. The sound of the doors opening in front of them echoed through the hallway, and Jonathan felt something inside him break a little more with each passing second. The cell doors opened with a metallic screech, and he was shoved into a small, cold space. It wasn't the first time he'd been in a cell, but it was the first time he'd truly felt like a prisoner. He stood there for a moment, the door clanging shut behind him, the click of the lock echoing in his ears. He couldn't escape this. He couldn't escape what he'd done. His thoughts were a blur of confusion and guilt. Everything he had done, everything he had been, had led him here. And the worst part was, there was no one to blame but himself. The cold metal cot in the corner of the cell was stark and uninviting, the only furniture in the barren room. He slumped down onto it, his hands still shaking, his mind running in circles. What could he do now? How could he live with this? The weight of his actions pressed down on him like 1,000 tons. He closed his eyes, trying to block it all out, but it was impossible. Every moment of his life had led him to this moment. Every choice, every mistake. He wanted to scream, to punch the walls, to break free from this nightmare. But there was no way out. No escape. The only thing left was the suffocating silence of the cell, and the constant echo of his own guilt. The minutes stretched on, endless and suffocating. He didn't know how much time had passed. His thoughts were spinning, tangled in a web of regret and horror. How could he face anyone now? How could he face his family, his friends, knowing what he had done? The cell felt even smaller now, the walls pressing in tighter, the air growing colder. His chest ached with every breath, the weight of what he had done unbearable. And then, in the stillness of the night, he heard something. A voice. It was distant, faint, but unmistakable. His mother's voice. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel her presence, the weight of her love and disappointment. And it tore through him like a knife. In that moment, Jonathan realized something. He was never going to escape this. The guilt would follow him forever. And he would have to live with that for the rest of his life. The weight of his realization settled like a thick fog around him. There was no escape from what he had done. Not now. Not ever. The cell felt even smaller, tighter. His breaths came shallow, the air in the room thick and stale. The flickering fluorescent light above cast eerie shadows that danced across the cold, concrete walls. Jonathan lay back on the cot, staring up at the ceiling, his mind spiraling into dark, endless thoughts. He could still hear his mother's voice, faint and distant, echoing in his mind. He could almost see her face, the pain and the disappointment etched into every feature. Her words rang in his ears, sharper now than ever. "You killed her, Jonathan. You killed her." The guilt twisted inside him, gnawing at him from every direction. How had it all gone so wrong? He had been angry. He had felt trapped, suffocated by the circumstances of his life. But none of that had justified what he had done. Not even for a second. A soft, almost imperceptible sound broke through his thoughts, a muffled cry, distant and sorrowful. He couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it seemed to be all around him. Was it the prison walls closing in on him? Or was it just the echo of his own guilt, reverberating through his mind? Jonathan squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the endless parade of images. His grandma, her frailty, the knife in his hand, her final breath, the empty look in her eyes. It was all too much. His throat tightened, and he could feel the tears rising, threatening to spill over, but he refused to let them come. He refused to break. Not here. Not now. But the memories, the sound of her voice in his head, wouldn't leave him. "I loved you, Jonathan," her voice echoed in his mind. The words were a painful reminder of everything he had lost. The sound of the distant cry grew louder, more desperate, pulling him deeper into his own despair. He wanted to scream, to break free from the suffocating grip of his thoughts. But he couldn't. He was trapped, both physically and mentally. The silence of the cell was deafening now, louder than any noise he had ever known. Jonathan rolled over onto his side, pulling his knees close to his chest, trying to make himself as small as possible. The guilt was overwhelming, crushing him, until he felt like he could hardly breathe. He had killed his grandmother, the one person who had always been there for him, the one person who had shown him love when no one else had. And now she was gone. And he was the one who had taken her life. The realization hit him again, sharper this time, like a blade slicing through the fog of his mind. His chest tightened, and he fought back the sobs that threatened to overtake him. But it was useless. The tears came anyway, silent and uncontrollable. For the first time since it had happened, Jonathan allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. He allowed himself to mourn, not just for his grandmother, but for the person he had become. The person he could never undo. The tears soaked the pillow beneath his head, but Jonathan didn't care. He let himself break, just for a moment, before the reality of his situation sank in again. This was his life now. A life defined by a single, terrible act. And there would be no escaping it. No way to erase what he had done. Not ever. The sobs racked his body, each one deeper than the last. The rawness of his emotions, the guilt, the pain, was like a suffocating weight. Each breath felt harder than the last, like his chest was closing in on itself. The tears streamed down his face, but he didn't bother to wipe them away. They were the only thing that felt real now. The only thing that reminded him that he was still human, despite the horror he had created. He curled tighter into himself, the cot offering no comfort, the concrete floor beneath him too cold and unyielding to provide any escape. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow longer, more distorted in the dim light, like they were closing in on him. There was no peace in this silence. No refuge. Only the endless, oppressive weight of what he had done. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as Jonathan lay there, his mind lost in a never-ending loop of regret and sorrow. His grandma's face flashed in his mind again. Her soft features, the tenderness in her eyes, and the sharp terror that had replaced it in her final moments. He could still hear her voice, faint and distant, as if she were calling out to him, trying to reach him from beyond the grave. "Why, Jonathan? Why did you do this?" He clutched his head in his hands, trying to block out the echo of her voice, but it was useless. Her words lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of his betrayal. And then another thought crept in, a darker thought. What if he deserved to be here? What if he was meant to be trapped in this hell of his own making? What if this was his punishment, the only thing that could possibly make up for what he had done? He had taken her life, and in return, his own life had been shattered beyond repair. Wasn't that the way it worked? The thought settled over him like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. He had murdered her, and now he would pay for it. The guilt gnawed at him, relentless, a constant reminder that there was no redemption, no second chance. The universe had handed him his fate, and now he would have to face it. His tears slowly stopped, but the emptiness remained. The weight in his chest was unrelenting, like the walls of his prison were slowly closing in, squeezing the air from his lungs. He lay there in the darkness, the sound of his own breathing the only thing that filled the room. And for the first time, he realized that he might never escape this feeling. He might never escape what he had done. In that silence, Jonathan knew he was trapped. Not just in the cell, but in the memories, in the guilt, in the knowledge that he would carry this with him for the rest of his life. He closed his eyes, the tears that had stopped flowing still fresh in his mind, and he wondered if there would ever be a moment when the pain would fade. But deep down, he knew the answer. It never would. The darkness in the cell felt absolute now, a suffocating void that seemed to pull the very air from his lungs. Jonathan lay still, his body stiff, his mind frozen in place, as if time had somehow stopped. The flickering light above him seemed to pulse, matching the erratic beating of his heart. There was no escape, no relief. He had killed his grandmother. And now, here he was, lost in the consequences, alone in the cold, empty cell. He could feel the hours dragging on, each minute stretching into an eternity of torment. His body ached from the stillness, but his mind was a prison far worse than the one surrounding him. He heard the distant echo of voices from the hallway, the muffled sounds of guards talking to one another, but none of it reached him. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered anymore. His thoughts wandered again, back to the day it all happened, the day his world had shattered. It had started so differently. He had woken up with the same thoughts, the same anger that had been building for weeks, months. The constant feeling of being trapped. The tension between him and his grandmother, the only person left to care for him. He had been so frustrated, so ready to lash out. And then it had happened. The argument, the shouting, and the knife. Jonathan squeezed his eyes shut again, as if somehow he could erase the memory, but it clung to him, refusing to let go. Her final breath, the horror in her eyes, her frailty. He had done that. He had killed her. And now, there was no turning back. The clock on the wall in the hallway outside the cell ticked steadily, marking the passing of time, but to Jonathan, it felt like a cruel reminder that his life was forever on pause. Forever defined by that one moment. A moment he could never undo. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder, drawing nearer. Jonathan didn't look up. He didn't care who it was or why they were coming. He had no energy to face anyone, to try to explain, to apologize. What could he say? How could he explain the depth of his remorse? It was too late for that. He had taken everything from her. His grandmother had been the last person to truly care for him. And now she was gone. The footsteps stopped just outside his cell, and Jonathan heard the sound of keys jingling. A moment later, the door swung open, and a guard stepped inside. Jonathan didn't move. The guard's eyes scanned the room for a moment, then fixed on Jonathan. "Visitor," the guard said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. Visitor. The word echoed in Jonathan's mind like a cruel joke. Who would come to visit him now? His parents? Would they come to see the monster he had become? Would they come to face the son who had destroyed everything? Jonathan didn't move, didn't speak. He couldn't bring himself to face them. The guard waited for a moment, his gaze lingering on Jonathan before he turned and walked away, leaving the door ajar. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He had been expecting someone, but now that the moment was here, he didn't know what to do. Who could possibly want to visit him now? The minutes dragged by, each one filled with the silent weight of his own shame. Who was out there? Who could still care? He didn't know, but the thought of facing them, of facing anyone, felt impossible. The door to his cell creaked open once again. Jonathan didn't look up this time either. He knew that the person standing there now would be the one who would shatter whatever little was left of his world. He wasn't sure he was ready for it, but there was no escaping it now. The door creaked open once more, and this time, Jonathan couldn't ignore it. The sound, sharp and unnerving, made him stir slightly, but he remained facing the cold, gray wall, his body rigid. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, the echoes bouncing off the stark walls of the small cell. He didn't look up. He couldn't bring himself to face whoever it was. His entire body screamed to stay hidden, to pretend they weren't there, but that was impossible. The footsteps stopped right in front of him. Jonathan could feel the weight of the presence, the quiet anticipation in the air. For a long moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that weighed so heavily, it pressed down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. His heart pounded in his ears. And then, finally, a voice broke the stillness. Jonathan. It was his mother's voice. Her tone was soft, broken, but unmistakable. Jonathan's throat tightened at the sound. He didn't move, his eyes staring ahead, unable to look at her. He could feel her presence, feel the emotions hanging in the air between them. But he couldn't bring himself to face her. Not now. She took a step closer, and he felt the shift in the air around him. She was right there, standing beside him. "I came to see you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Her words pierced through him like a knife. She had come. She had come to see the son who had shattered everything. The son who had taken away the only person who had ever truly cared for him. Jonathan squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the wave of guilt and regret that crashed over him. He felt the sting of tears at the corners of his eyes, but he wouldn't let them fall. He couldn't let them fall. Not here. Not now. His mother didn't speak for a long time. Jonathan could feel her there, standing beside him, waiting for him to respond, but he couldn't find the words. What could he possibly say? He had taken everything from her. Everything. He had destroyed her mother, the woman who had been his only support, the one who had loved him unconditionally. He had taken that love and shattered it. His chest tightened with the weight of the realization. And then, his mother's hand gently touched his shoulder, a soft, tender gesture that nearly broke him. "Jonathan," she said again, her voice trembling now, thick with emotion. "Why? Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air, more painful than any accusation, more devastating than anything she could have said. Why? It wasn't anger in her voice. It was grief. A grief that Jonathan could feel deep in his bones. His mouth went dry, and for the first time, he lifted his head slightly, just enough to see her face through the corner of his vision. She was standing so close, but she might as well have been miles away. Her eyes were swollen, red from crying, her face pale, streaked with tears. Jonathan's throat constricted as he looked at her, his heart shattering under the weight of her pain. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. But the words felt hollow. How could he say he didn't mean to? He had done it. He had killed her. His mother stood there, silent for a moment, as if absorbing his words, but nothing changed. The pain was still there, raw and unyielding. Her expression didn't soften. She stepped back slightly, taking a breath, trying to compose herself. "Jonathan." She swallowed hard, as though it physically hurt her to speak his name. "I can't." She stopped, unable to finish. Jonathan's heart ached. She couldn't forgive him. She couldn't even look at him without breaking. The silence between them stretched on, longer than it had ever been, and Jonathan felt the weight of it pressing against him. He wanted to reach out, to apologize, to somehow make it right. But he knew deep down there was no way to fix this. No way to undo the damage. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking with the rawness of the truth. But the words felt meaningless. His mother looked at him one last time, her face a mask of sorrow and disbelief, before she turned and walked away, leaving him alone again in the cold, silent cell. The door clicked shut behind her, and Jonathan was left with the suffocating reality of what he had done. And the truth that no apology, no tear, no word could ever bring her back. The silence of the cell rushed back in, filling every corner, every inch of the small, cold space. Jonathan sat there, motionless, his mind reeling with the weight of what had just happened. He had seen her face, heard her words, felt the heartbreak in her touch. And yet, there was no relief. No release from the suffocating guilt that gripped him. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape what he had done. His body felt like it was made of lead, heavy and unresponsive, as he tried to process the finality of the moment. His mother had left him, not with anger or hate, but with the kind of sorrow that threatened to break even the hardest heart. And yet, Jonathan knew he deserved it. He deserved every ounce of pain she was feeling. He deserved to be left in this darkness, alone with the consequences of his actions. He closed his eyes and let the image of her face fill his mind again. The tears, the pain, the disbelief. How could he ever make it right? How could he ever atone for what he had done? The thought crushed him. He had destroyed everything. His family, his future. And there was no coming back from it. The moments that followed seemed to blur together in a haze of regret, his mind unable to focus on anything other than the emptiness that surrounded him. The walls of the cell seemed to close in even further, the air growing thicker, colder. It was as if the very space was trying to swallow him whole, and he welcomed it. Maybe he deserved to disappear. Maybe he deserved to be lost, forever trapped in this nightmare. The sound of his own breathing filled the air, but everything else was a void. Time passed, though Jonathan didn't know how long it had been. Minutes? Hours? Days? He couldn't keep track anymore. There was no distinction between time and agony. Everything felt like one endless, unrelenting stretch of suffering. The door to his cell opened again, but this time Jonathan didn't react. He didn't move. Whoever it was could stand there all day, and he wouldn't acknowledge them. But then, he heard the footsteps. Slow. Measured. It wasn't a guard. It was someone else. Someone familiar. Someone who had been there from the start. Jonathan turned his head slowly, just enough to see the figure standing in the doorway. His father. The man who had never really been there. The man who had left them when Jonathan was just a child, disappearing without a word, without a second thought. And now here he was. Jonathan's throat tightened. What was he doing here? What could he possibly want after everything? His father didn't move at first, just stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning Jonathan, taking in the broken, unrecognizable version of the son he had abandoned. Jonathan couldn't find the words. What could he say to the man who had disappeared from his life, only to reappear at the worst possible moment? His father took a step forward, the floor creaking under his weight. But Jonathan didn't speak. He just stared at him, his chest tight with a mix of emotions. Disappointment, anger, fear. His father finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "I don't know what to say, Jonathan," he began, the words coming out with difficulty, as though they were being forced from him. Jonathan didn't respond. He couldn't. "You've destroyed everything," his father continued, a bitterness creeping into his tone. "You've thrown it all away. Your life. Your future." The words stung, but they weren't new. Jonathan had heard them before, echoes of the things he had already said to himself 1,000 times over. But his father paused, almost as if unsure of how to continue. "I'm here because you're still my son. Despite everything, I'm here." The words hung in the air between them, thick with tension. Jonathan's eyes flickered briefly toward his father, but then he looked away, unable to meet his gaze. He wasn't sure if he could bear it. "I'm sorry," his father said, the words heavy and awkward in the stillness of the room. "I don't know if it matters, but I am sorry." Jonathan wanted to respond. He wanted to scream, to tell his father how much he hated him for abandoning him all those years ago. But the words wouldn't come. He was too tired, too broken. And in the end, he knew that no matter what his father said, it wouldn't change a thing. He had killed his grandmother. And nothing, not his father's presence, nor his apology, could ever undo that. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Jonathan's eyes remained fixed on the floor, avoiding his father's gaze. He couldn't look at him. Not now. Not when everything he had ever known was in pieces, shattered by his own hands. His father stood there, waiting for something, anything, but Jonathan couldn't bring himself to say a word. The apology, the regret in his father's voice, felt distant, like an echo of something that no longer mattered. What good was an apology now? What good was anything? Jonathan had already ruined everything. The one person who had cared for him was gone, and there was no coming back from that. The room felt colder as his father lingered, standing still as though lost in his own thoughts. But Jonathan couldn't connect with him. Not anymore. "I don't expect forgiveness," his father finally spoke, his voice softer now, as if understanding the hopelessness that had settled into the room. Jonathan didn't respond. I just want you to know that I wish it hadn't come to this." His father's words faltered, as though he were struggling to find the right ones. "I don't know what happened to you, Jonathan. But whatever it was, it shouldn't have led to this." Jonathan could hear the crack in his father's voice, the sound of someone who had failed to protect his son, failed to stop the inevitable from unfolding. But Jonathan didn't know how to react. He was numb. Nothing his father said could fill the chasm inside him, the emptiness that had taken root the moment he had taken his grandmother's life. "You were a good kid once," his father continued, almost as if speaking to himself. "I don't know where it went wrong, but I know it's too late now." Jonathan's throat tightened. He wanted to scream. He wanted to let the anger, the frustration, pour out of him, but the words wouldn't come. His father's apology, the sorrow in his voice, it wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. "Goodbye, Jonathan," his father said after a long pause, his voice soft but final. Jonathan didn't move. His father turned and walked toward the door, the sound of his footsteps growing fainter as he left. Jonathan was left in the silence once again, the weight of everything pressing down on him. There was no redemption, no escape. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, marking the passage of time, but it felt like the hours had turned into a blur, each one blending into the next. Jonathan's mind was a fog, his thoughts trapped in an endless loop of regret, shame, and pain. What was left for him now? What was the point of anything? His father was gone, just like everyone else. And his grandmother, she was gone too. The image of her face, the fear in her eyes, flashed in his mind once more, and Jonathan squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out. But it wouldn't go away. It never would. The cell around him felt smaller, more suffocating with each passing second, as though it was closing in on him, trapping him in a never-ending cycle of his own guilt. He thought about the years ahead, years spent in this hell, with nothing to show for it except the memory of what he had done. There was no escape from the truth. There was no redemption, no way to undo what had been done. And as he sat there, alone in the darkness, Jonathan realized he had no idea what to do next. All that was left was the endless void, the emptiness, the weight of everything he had destroyed. And that was all he would ever know. The hours stretched on, but time had become an abstract concept to Jonathan now. He couldn't tell if it was day or night. The dim light filtering through the small window high up on the wall did little to give him any sense of the outside world. He hadn't moved since his father left, hadn't even bothered to shift his position. His legs had gone numb, his body stiff and aching from sitting motionless. But the pain was familiar. It was almost comforting, in a strange way. The physical discomfort reminded him that he was still alive, still existing in this bleak reality, even if he didn't want to be. The cell had become his world, a place of suffocating solitude. It felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing tighter with every passing minute. His mind, however, was a far more dangerous place. It was a cacophony of images, sounds, and emotions all crashing together, fighting for dominance. His grandmother's terrified face, his mother's sorrowful gaze, the sound of the knife, cutting through the air, the final breath of a life taken in an instant, and his own voice, whispering the words that had done nothing to change the truth. "I'm sorry."
Sorry.
That word had lost all meaning. It was a hollow, empty sound, floating in the air like smoke, gone the moment it was uttered. Nothing he said would bring her back. Nothing would fix the gaping wound he had created. His chest tightened again, and the familiar pang of guilt gnawed at him. He could hear the sound of footsteps once more, but this time they didn't stop at his door. They kept moving. Distant voices drifted down the hallway, muffled by the thick stone walls. It was almost a comfort, this quiet chaos around him, the world moving on without him. Jonathan closed his eyes and let the noise fade into the background, focusing instead on the rhythm of his breathing.
In, out.
A mechanical act, keeping him tethered to the world, even though his soul had long since detached from it. The sound of a door opening somewhere down the hall, the click of a lock. But then something shifted in the air, something he couldn't quite place. A shadow lingered in the doorway. Jonathan didn't move, not at first. It was probably just another guard, another routine check. But then, a voice cut through the quiet, soft and hesitant, but unmistakable. "Jonathan?" He froze. The voice was familiar, but it didn't belong here. He couldn't believe it. His head snapped up, and his eyes widened in disbelief. Standing in the doorway was his mother. She had returned. Her face was drawn and pale, her eyes red from crying, but she was there. Jonathan's chest tightened painfully as he stared at her. Why was she back? Why would she come back to him? He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though his throat had closed up, as if the guilt had choked him silent. His mother stepped inside cautiously, her footsteps hesitant. She didn't come any closer at first, just stood there in the dim light, her gaze fixed on him. "Jonathan." Her voice trembled, the word hanging in the air like a prayer.
He didn't know what to say.
He didn't know how to respond to this.
What did she want from him?
What could he give her? His mother took a deep breath, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out, as if unsure of how to bridge the distance between them. "I don't know what I expected, Jonathan," she whispered, almost to herself. "I thought, maybe, seeing you here, seeing you in this place, I thought I'd feel something different. Maybe I'd find a way to forgive you." She paused, her breath catching in her throat. "But I don't know if I can." The words struck him like a physical blow, sharper than anything he had felt before. He had known she wouldn't forgive him, but hearing it, saying it, made it real. She continued, her voice barely audible, full of the weight of years of pain. "How could I forgive you for what you did? How could I ever, after everything you've taken from us?" Her gaze held him, and for a brief moment, Jonathan saw not just the mother who had come to visit her son, but the woman who had lost everything because of him. Her pain was as tangible as his own. The words hung between them, unspoken but understood. Jonathan's head drooped, his heart hammering painfully in his chest. He had nothing to say, nothing to offer. His mother didn't move closer. She stood at the threshold of the cell, watching him, waiting. And Jonathan sat there, lost in the silence, drowning in the consequences of his actions, unable to escape the truth. He had destroyed everything, and no apology would ever change that. The moments stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Jonathan could feel the air growing heavy as his mother stood in the doorway, her gaze fixed on him, her expression a mix of sorrow and disbelief. She hadn't stepped forward, hadn't come any closer. It was as if she didn't know what to do with him anymore. And he couldn't blame her. The guilt that churned inside him was unbearable, a constant, aching reminder of what he had done. His body felt like it was made of stone, weighed down by the sheer magnitude of the consequences he had to face. His mother's voice broke the silence, once more, shaky and fragile. "Do you even understand what you've done?" she asked, her words almost too quiet to hear, but they cut through him with the sharpness of a knife. Jonathan's throat tightened. He couldn't look at her. He didn't dare. "I've lost everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And I'm not sure if there's any part of you left that can even feel the weight of that." Jonathan clenched his fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. The pain felt almost good. It reminded him that he was still here, still alive, still trapped in this nightmare of his own making. He had killed his grandmother, and there was no undoing it. There was no escape from the reality that had shattered everything. His mother's breath was shaky as she continued, each word laced with heartbreak. "I've tried, Jonathan. I've tried to understand, tried to make sense of it. But I can't. I can't forgive you. I don't think I ever will." The words hung in the air, sharp and jagged, and Jonathan felt as though the ground had been ripped from under him. He had known this would happen, had known that nothing he did could ever make up for the life he had taken. But hearing her say it, hearing it in her voice, it felt like the final, irrevocable end. The door behind her closed quietly, but Jonathan didn't move. The space between them remained vast and insurmountable. No apology would heal the wound. No explanation would fix what had been broken. And as he sat there in the cold silence, Jonathan realized the truth. He was beyond redemption. Jonathan sat in the silence, the weight of his mother's words pressing on him, sinking deeper with every passing second. The door had closed behind her, but the echo of her voice lingered, a constant reminder of everything he had destroyed. He didn't know how much time had passed since she left. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. Time had become irrelevant in this place, this suffocating reality he now inhabited. His eyes were fixed on the cold stone floor beneath him, the same floor that had borne witness to his regret, to the irreversible actions that had taken him down this dark path. The pain inside him felt endless, a churning storm that refused to subside. He had murdered his grandmother, the woman who had shown him nothing but love. He had taken everything from his mother, who would never look at him the same way again. And now he was alone. Completely alone. His mind drifted, though it was a haze of confusion and sorrow. He thought about what might have been if he had made different choices. If he had been different, could things have turned out better? Could he have avoided this descent into darkness? But those thoughts, too, felt pointless. There was no changing what had been done, no turning back the clock. The world outside, the world he had once known, was gone to him now. He had severed all ties with it. There was no redemption, no forgiveness that could undo the irreversible. Jonathan closed his eyes, letting the weight of everything wash over him one final time. He could feel the sting of tears at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't fight them. What was the point? Tears wouldn't bring her back, and they wouldn't change what he had done. He opened his eyes, his gaze lifting from the floor to the small window above him, the one that offered only a sliver of light. The outside world was beyond that window, but it felt as though it belonged to someone else now. A life that wasn't his. A world that had moved on without him. Jonathan's breath hitched in his throat, but there was no sob, no cry for mercy. There was only the quiet, numbing acceptance of his fate. And in the end, that was all that remained. The silence was thick again, impenetrable. The cell, the walls, the darkness, it was all that he knew now. And maybe, just maybe, it was where he was meant to be. For the rest of his life, the cold stone walls would be his only companions. And the weight of his actions would be the only thing that ever truly mattered. The door was locked, the world outside beyond his reach, and Jonathan understood. He was alone with his choices, and that would never change.